Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at Tamiya's 1/48 scale F-14A Tomcat. I've heard great things about this kit, so I cannot wait to open this thing up and see how it gets on. I hope you enjoy. So then, something a little bit different for me in this build. I'm going to be using some Red Fox Studio decals. What these are pretty much 3D printed decals which display an insane amount of detail, something which I could personally never achieve. However, if you are going to use these, you do have to get rid of any underlying details. So you have a very painful task of scraping away all these lovely details that are molded by Tamiya. So the best way that I found to do this was to initially use a blade to get rid of any of the really high details, and then use some sandpaper just to level everything out and make it much easier for the decal to be applied. Tamiya follow their usual approach for all the control panels as they slot into these recessed gaps. Perfect fit here, you know, there's no surprises. This is a Tamiya kit, the fit is just going to be superb. So as you can see, I am inserting all of these nice and smooth panels into the cockpit now. I was thinking about maybe potentially putting the Red Fox decals on when they were outside of the cockpit. However, for the uniformity's sake of the paint, I thought I'd glue them all in and paint everything together as one. So the general build-up of the cockpit is quite simplistic in the fact that there's not a huge amount of parts which have to be inserted in, but in my opinion this isn't negative, as I think that from what you can see in the cockpit, especially with the addition of a Red Fox Studio decal set, there's more than enough detail and more than enough to look at in the finished model. Red Fox provide you with a pamphlet in their set which pretty much tells you all the pieces which have to be sanded down and where the corresponding decals go. So it was a really simple process. So once all control panels and also instrument panels have been sanded down and nice and smooth, I can then come and coat the entire cockpit in a light grey colour. Light grey colour is going to be by Ammo MIG. I'm going to be on the whole using Ammo MIG throughout this build as it's my preferred medium to use. Once the light grey colour has completely dried, I can then move on to putting all of the decals onto the actual model. So Red Fox recommend that you use PVA glue here, so that's exactly what I did, and it seemed to work fine. My only thing that I would say is probably that you have to make sure that once they're in place you do not touch them at all, because as you know, PVA glue does have a relatively long setting time, so it is susceptible to movement. That movement is brilliant for when you're trying to get them in place, because placement is definitely key here. If you had them a bit wonky, I can imagine that it would look pretty awful. So in regards to that, it's absolutely brilliant to use PVA glue. However, once it's in the right place, just be really careful. The decals themselves are absolutely superb, as you can see from these clips. The details on them, especially in the gauges, in my opinion, is sublime. Absolutely brilliant to look at. I've never personally seen, you know, one of these in the flesh, and it looks so good. I was just like, wow, I need to do this with probably quite a few more of my models. I'm not saying that I'm only going to use Red Fox from now on, as I think being able to detail paint a cockpit by yourself is definitely an important skill to have as a modeler. However, occasionally maybe using one of these could be a bit of fun. So now I can have a look at the ejection seats. The ejection seats are a very basic build up where you have two pieces which go together to build out the frame. Then you have a lower section and an upper section, and also the ejection handles which can then be plonked on top. Tamiya ejection seats, in my opinion, are really nice, as in they're easy to build up and they still have a sufficient amount of detail. In my opinion, mucking around with a load of parts on ejection seats sometimes just gets fiddly. So in regards to painting, they were both initially given a black primer, and then I'm going to paint them in this beigey deserty colour for the padding, or I guess padding's the right word for this, or cushions. Cushions seems too laid back, but I hope you get what I mean. So once that was done, I'm then going to do some dry brushing. This is just going to help to pick out and highlight all of those raised details. As you can see, it's not a very delicate process. It's just kind of scrape the living hell out of it, but make sure you don't have too much paint on your brush when you're doing this. I can then go on to pick out a couple more details, this in the clip being the ejection handles, and just one or two other little bits and bobs, you know, a couple of metallic elements. I can then go on to also put one of two, I think, decals onto this thing. There's really not too many, but the decals do help to give an extra element to it, so I do recommend that you do it. And once I've done that twice, here we are. I give them both a gloss varnish before then using a pin wash just to bring out those recessed details. I'm utilising the capillary action here just to help that oil wash be drawn just through all the recesses. It's quite satisfying to watch, I must say, and the end result definitely adds a 3D effect. I can then paint a khaki rim around the padding or the cushion as per se, and that was my ejection seats done. Looking on to the glare shields, these are quite unique in the F-14 in the fact that they're dual tone, one sort of looking like a bit of a leather or a canvas sort of thing, and then the other bit being your basic sort of black colour. To help bring out the quite monotone colour of the canvas or beigey looking colour, I'm also utilising some oils and a pin wash here just to bring out some tones and, you know, make them look a little bit less bland. The ejection seats are given a satin varnish and can then be plonked into the cockpit. I didn't want to do a gloss varnish or a satin varnish on the entirety of the cockpit where the Red Fox decals are, purely because they have these very cleverly placed gloss patches in areas where there are screens, and I didn't want to ruin that. The rest of the cockpit assembly is quite straightforward. A couple of side walls and also the glare shields can be plonked on. No issues whatsoever here, really enjoyable. So with my short and sweet time with Red Fox out of the way, I can now move on to a more basic and normal form of building. Here you can see me building up the front nose gear bay. This is a nice sort of jig system as per se, or at least everything kind of slots and, you know, clicks into each other. Very, very Tamiya-esque, and the end result definitely gives you a lot of detail which is ready to be painted. Once everything was slotted together, I did give the general construction a base coat of white before coming in and picking out some details, especially some metallic elements of where there would probably be hydraulics and all of that sort of gumph, which I'm not going to get into because, as we know, my technical language is not brilliant. However, it was very easy to pick out all of these details. Sometimes manufacturers, their details kind of morph into nothingness, and it makes it incredibly hard to pick out some of these details. However, Tamiya's is nice and pronounced and easy to make look good. I'll then give the entire assembly a gloss varnish before then once again utilising some oils to grubby it up and make it more used. So the pin wash can then also be cleaned up using clean brush and some white spirit just to tidy it up, as before it looks a little bit unruly. I want it to be dirty, but I want it to be somewhat contained. So I can now mount these two assemblies together. Interestingly, this only took me an afternoon to get this far into the build, which I thought was absolutely insane. This is a credit to both Red Fox and also the incredible Tamiya engineering. Putting the two assemblies into the front part of the fuselage was really simple, as there were nice big guiding pins into locating guiding holes, I guess. Well, not holes, but indentations. Very simple, and you get a nice satisfying click when you get it into the right place, which I always find quite Lego-esque and quite satisfying. With the two halves of the front portion of the fuselage together, I can add a couple of panels. The panels are for the gun, and also one or two are for the access ladders. These can be stowed in or out. I personally, for this build, wanted to have them stowed inwards, as I didn't really want to break the flow of the rather sleek looking F-14. I think it's good to note that I actually did have to sand a seam on the front nose cone. There is quite, it'll probably be visible if you left it, but there's a visible seam line down the front nose cone, which I just used a little bit of VMS super glue to form a really strong bond and then sand it back. Only took me about 5 minutes, but it's a modification which I think is worth doing. Here you can see me using some screws and some metallic elements to put together Tamiya's superbly engineered sweep wing design. It's just incredibly smooth, and with all of the other brace parts and the nice gear mechanism, it's just, I found myself just kind of sweeping in and out for about 10 minutes. It was a little bit embarrassing. I can now then go on to building up the front portions of the air intakes. There is a couple of pieces which have to go on top of it, which is a really nice attention to detail. I believe this is just something on the F-14 which is able to move in regards to countering different airflows and everything through the intakes. I might be wrong there, but from what I have read, that's what I think is correct. So it's now just a matter of populating the up half of the fuselage. This is with the gear bays and all the different bits and bobs, such as these poly caps which have to go in the back of it. This is for the elevators to ensure that they can move up and down freely. Also, as you can see there, it's really nicely indentated with an L or an R, depicting of course left and right. It's a small detail, but it's something which I personally like, because I of course mix up the parts every so often, as do I think most people. I don't think I'm being silly there, so always good to have parts like that indentated to make sure you know what you're doing. The air intakes here also go together with a really satisfying snap, and also don't leave any really visible seam lines, which I'm very happy about, because I'm done with sanding the insides of intakes. If you've watched my previous 2 videos, you know what I mean. So I then went on to put in the front forward facing fan for the front intake. I did a little bit of sponge chipping here, nothing too much because it's not an incredibly visible element, so there's no point in spending a huge amount of time on it. Sponge chipping, as you saw on the front part of the fan, is just a really simple way to add another element to your fans when you don't want to spend a huge amount of time on them. So the rest of the air intake can now be fully glued and cemented together, and then it can be cemented to the underside of the fuselage. I did have to do a very small amount of flexing just to get this into the right place. However, once it's in there, it's really snug. So I can then now join the front half of the fuselage and also the rear half of the fuselage. These go together incredibly well. It is just like slides in, and the friction fit alone is probably enough to keep them in place. However, don't do that. Do cement your parts together. Don't be a melon. So there are now 1 or 2 panels which have to be cemented on just to keep the continuity of everything going, and then I can move on to the exhausts. So Tamiya give you the option to have them in the open or in the closed position. I personally opted for the open, as I think the closed just looks a little bit odd. I've definitely had a couple of conversations with my friends on Instagram about them, and we all agreed that the open variant or open configuration looks far better. So I didn't have a huge plan going into this about how I wanted them to really properly look and how I wanted to do it, but what I ended up doing was just a bit of experimenting with some chipping fluid and like sponge chipping the chipping fluid on. That's a lot of chippings, and just kind of building it up in layers. I think the best thing to do with most effects in modelling is it to be done in layers, you know, just slowly building it up. I mucked around with a couple of different, you know, tones of metal, that's brass, and also a couple of some blues, kind of translucent, transparency blues, just to bring a couple of colours and a couple of visual interest elements to it, and it turned out quite well in the end, as I'm sure you'll see in the final photos. So you have to choose what loadout you're going to be carrying on your F-14, and at that stage you then have to put the corresponding parts on. I'm going to be carrying 4 Phoenixes, 2 AIM-7s and 2 AIM-9s for mine, so I put of course the corresponding parts on. I then went on to mask and paint the front portion of the canopy in a transparent blue colour, as that is what the instructions and of course the real aircraft has. The kit also comes with some lovely masks which you do have to cut out yourself, but if you take your time they do fit perfectly. This kit features Tamiya's quite iconic way of doing the front parts of the canopy, and it's almost in a one part, but it just helps to make sure that there aren't any awkward seams to clear up, so always very happy when I see this. The aft sections of the canopy also have corresponding masks which can be cut out. There are masks which would cover the entirety of the canopy, so you wouldn't actually have to use masking fluid, but of course, just because I'm a little bit lazy, I did. So with all of the pieces and the sub-assemblies all built up, I can then go on to priming them. Primer today is going to be Ammo's one-shot primer. Once everything's primed up, I can start doing my first of quite a few pre-shading or painting techniques. These just help to make the F-14 look a little bit more at home. So the first thing that I wanted to do was use these marbling or mottle stencils onto all of the surfaces. So what this does is replicate this salt weathered sort of effect that a lot of these Navy aircraft have. It's this just really sort of patchy effect, and it's incredibly hard to replicate that just by hand. So these mottle stencils definitely help to bring it to another level. So the way that I'm spraying these on here is I'm just using a variety of greys. I believe gunship grey and like light gunship grey and all these sort of gunship greys. Doesn't have to be specific, just usually keep it to a slightly lighter colour than what you're going to be spraying with. And then I'm going to do it more heavy in some places and less in other places, a bit of randomness. It just helps to sell the effect, in my opinion. It just helps to kind of show that this plane has been out at sea and it has been absolutely battered by all the elements, and that's just what you have to do. So once all of the surfaces were covered in this mottle and marble texture, I can then go on to spraying the actual colour that I'm going for. In this case, it is going to be a light grey. So this is really dusted on. So when I say dusted, I mean that I'm spraying from probably much further back than I usually would, at a slightly lower PSI as well. I think I'm only spraying at about 25 PSI here compared to my usual 30, and that just helps me to kind of moderate how much paint is going onto the aircraft. Something which I say in a lot of my builds is every so often stop and just kind of look at it from a distance, you know, look at it at different lights, and that's what I do a lot of the time throughout this, just to gauge how much paint have I put on. Am I happy with how much paint is on? Do I need to put more? Do I need to stop there, you know? But here we go, that was it, all sorted, and then I can go on to my second effect. This time it's an effect which I've personally never actually done, so there's no time like the present to do some experimenting. However, I probably wouldn't experiment on a kit as you know, expensive as this one is an incredible kit. So of course it comes with quite a hefty price tag, so maybe use a scrap model before you try this effect. Don't be like me and just go in all guns blazing. But pretty much what this effect is I use some masking fluid to mask around the outsides of a couple of panel lines, so it looks like this, and then I come in and spray it with a white. The reason for this is giving me the idea of faded paint directly around the panels, which is evident on so many F-14s. I'm sure if you search up some photos, you will see how patchy the paintwork of these things are, especially in the fact that the actual paint is quite modulated, but then you also have bits of paint which have been all like flung off, and this is what that effect tries to kind of replicate, and I think it does an incredible job of that. So the only thing which I then have to personally do is then fade some of them back down again, as it was very in your face, you know, very bold. So to do that, I'll just use the light grey colour again and tone it back down. However, this was the final effect of that sort of paint stripped, you know, paint faded effects, and I was really happy as this as a base. As it was very visually interesting, it means that I don't have to work as hard on the weathering to create insane contrast and variation. So I can then go on to doing a bit of painting in regards to, you know, sectioning off areas. It's more of like a masking process. That includes, you know, as you saw, the rear halves of the wings, they are in this matte white instead of the light grey, and also the underside is a white instead of the light grey. However, it is quite hard to tell the difference here purely because I faded so much of the upper surface. However, I'm personally okay with that, as it does relate quite well to some reference images. Other elements that had to be painted were of course the vertical stabilizers and also the kind of anti-glare strip that goes over the canopy. This is more in regards to, you know, the scheme that you're choosing though, as it is different on different schemes and aircraft. With the main painting out of the way, I can then focus my attention on back to the exhaust, just making it look a little bit more, you know, burnt and a bit more grimy and a bit more like it's actually been used. This is the thing that I've kind of struggled with this build, is tying everything together. You know, if one bit looks insanely used and one bit looks pristine, it just completely ruins continuity of the model and then results in the model not looking as good as it potentially could be. So on screen you can see me putting together the exhaust. As you can see, it's a little bit different to when you first saw it. That's just because I went back and did a bit more variation with the metallics and just tried to make it look a bit more burnt, as I think it looks a bit too pristine with that silvery aluminium colour. So once again, as I was saying, trying to tie it all in, a bit of continuity always helps with the model. So I can now go back onto some sub-assemblies after spending God knows how long on painting. Here I am specifically making up the ordnance for this kit. So as I said, I've gone for 4 Phoenix missiles, so AIM 54s I believe they're called, 2 AIM 7s and 2 AIM 9s. The Phoenixes are incredible, they're almost like 4 mini kits within a kit though, because there's so many parts on them. Once they were all sorted though, I could go on to looking at the landing gear legs. These have a brilliant mix in my opinion of being superbly detailed but rugged at the same time. An issue which I've gone on in previous videos is having strong, landing gear legs, purely because I'd rather have strength over detail in my opinion. You can always add detail, but on the whole it's much harder to add strength into these sort of parts. But here Tamiya have done a brilliant job of having a very nice strong core frame and then having details which are kind of added on top of that. I'm sure there is definitely room here to put a couple of hydraulic wires and leads and all of that sort of shebang onto it. However, I thought that for me they were perfectly detailed as stock. I can now put them onto the model. They have really secure mechanisms of course to go on. I used a bit of VMS super glue here, as it is the best thing to keep a good strong bond. That was also used on putting any of the ordnance on. Here you can see me putting the drop tanks on along with the actual wheels. These were painted off camera, however they were just painted quite simply. I did a black base and then got a slightly lighter NATO black and went around the sort of the rims almost, just to give an element of use to them. With everything all painted up, I can then give all of the different sub-assemblies a gloss varnish before going on to the decals. So the decals were definitely a bit of a struggle for me personally, but I just don't mix very well with, Tamiya decals. But once I kind of got into the swing of them, they did start to go down really quite well. That being said, there were hundreds of them, especially these no step ones. I did think that doing the stencils was kind of vital for this, so yeah. Have a listen into this.
Well, thank God that is done, because my back is in pieces. Holy moly.
And just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, look at the sheer amount of decals for the Phoenixes. That being said, once I'd done them, I did think it was worth it because they looked absolutely mega on the underside of this model. They slot on really simply with 2 notches with corresponding notches in the Phoenixes. The AIM 7s, one of their fins goes into the inner side of the pylon, which I thought was really quite cool. And yeah, it really simple to get all the ordnance on, and probably really quite enjoyable in regards to, ordnance can sometimes be quite a laborious task, but it's quite easy. So on to weathering now. The first course of action for me was going to be doing a panel line wash. Instead of doing a very dark wash, which I've been using for gear bays and stuff, I instead wanted to do this dark sea blue color. My reasoning for this, instead of doing the dark panel wash, is the dark panel wash usually creates uncontrollable grime, in the fact that it will put grime in places where you don't really want to have grime. So this dark sea blue one, it pretty much just highlights the panels. It does this by pulling the oil wash through the panels using capillary action, and then I can come in with a clean brush and just clean everything up, and then I've got nicely highlighted panels and no unnecessary grime around it. As you can see in this clip, generally still very clean, but you can really see all of those panel lines, which is exactly what I wanted. So now I can go on to more controlled grime. This is when I create the grime. To do this, I pretty much concentrated all of my grime and weathering around areas where there were no step signs. This is just because this is where people are going to be walking. On the other side of their shoes, of course, there's going to be a bit of grime and dirt, so that felt the most realistic place to put it all. To do this, all I am doing is really gently putting some incredibly small amount of sort of dark shadow, I believe it's called, oil paint down first, and then I'll use this round-headed brush, just kind of stipple it in and brush it around to get a first layer of that grime, and then I will come on top, usually using a burnt umber or a burnt sienna, and that gives it that orangey sort of almost rusty looking, but it isn't actual rust, sort of colours. And that's another thing about this weathering. It's all about layers, in my opinion. Layers really enhance your weathering. It's something which you should probably try, you know, instead of just doing a panel wash, then just slapping all of your grime on, do a panel wash, then do your first layer of grime, then do your second layer of grime, and build it up like that. Talking about layers, here is how I weathered up the bags. So the bags are definitely something which I kind of had to wrap my brain around, is what are they going to look like, and I just thought that they're probably going to be pretty dusty, but then they're also going to be quite oily and a little bit of, you know, rust and seawater and all of that sort of stuff. So initially I wanted to create that dust, and that's just done by using a white oil paint, once again being stippled in using the same method that I used on the rest of the aircraft. I then came in with a slightly different colour, that is going to be a burnt umber diluted with white to give it this almost orangey, slightly faded looking colour. This is done in the exact same way, highly trying to concentrate it around the edges and areas where there's most likely going to be use of them. So once I've created a good gradient, I can then come in with the big guns, as per se. That is just a straight burnt umber or burnt sienna-y looking colour, and it can once again be stippled in, but I'm not going to stipple it in as much this time, as I want to have this nice highly concentrated orange popping out of the grey background. And this is what I got, and I was actually very happy with how these bags looked, as I think they tied into the model brilliantly. With all of that sorted, that was my weathering done for the model, and I could then go on to giving the model a satin varnish. It's, as usual, VMS's varnish, as I believe they give the best finish. So canopy masks come off, 1 or 2 details painted, and that is this model completely finished. So I hope you have enjoyed this video. I'd just like to take a quick moment to say a thank you to everyone for the support, as we've recently reached 3,000 subscribers, and the past few videos have been doing absolutely brilliantly. So a big thank you from me, and I hope you enjoy all the future content that we have coming. So without any further ado, this has been Tamiya's 1:48 scale F-14A Tomcat. Enjoy the final photos, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.